a quick introduction about myself and we'll get started. So my name is Raghavendra. So I've been in the application security space for the last 18 years. So started with a development experience for a couple of years, then started working on secure code reviews, penetration testing, threat modelings, DevSecOps, so predominantly in the banking domains. So yeah, we'll get started. If you have any questions, you can raise your hand or maybe you can drop your question in the chat. We'll try to accommodate all the questions. And I don't think so we have an opportunity to like have those question answer discussion sessions unless you put in the chat. I'll take your questions one by one at frequent intervals, and yeah, we'll get going. So you can put your thoughts, suggestions. If you're not able to understand me, if I'm too quick, too slow, right, you can put your thoughts in the chat as well. We'll take it. I think there's a separate answer session, not in the chat. There's a separate question answer session for that, right? So I'll just quickly start by sharing my screen. Yeah, let me know when you can see it. All right, I hope everyone is able to see. I'll just quickly start off with one slider, what we discussed last week. Just a introduction to see what we are going to discuss in detail today. Right. So I think, yeah, we discussed about these slides. So today we are going to concentrate more on the threat modeling. Yeah, the threat modeling phase, like threat modeling activity, which we do in the design phase, right? So we are going to understand the applications, potential threats that can arise, all right, with the architecture that is created, with the design documents that are being created, right? So even before the developers could start developing their source code, so we'll identify these potential threats so that they are noticed early in the development life cycle, and we can remediate them early, right? So any flaw here or a potential threat here can lead to a design flaw, right? Let's assume we created an architecture diagram, we did a threat modeling, and we went ahead into development and deployment, right? Then there we see a design bug, right? We'll have to revamp the whole architecture and then fix the issue, right? It may not be a proper fix because it's at the end stages. It has to be a patch fix, right? To avoid all those scenarios, right, we do a proper phase of security reviews here, and that will be called threat modeling. Right. So the main inputs for threat modeling will be security architecture reviews, or security architecture diagrams that will be created, and the design documents that are created. So we're going to take that as the input, architecture documents and the design documents as input. We are going to review the documents and then go ahead with threat modeling activities. So today in this session, mainly we'll cover what is threat modeling, why we are performing threat modeling, right? And what's the use of threat modeling, and how do we come up with a rating, severity rating levels, and a bit of tool demo that we can see how actual threat modeling works, right? So this is the agenda. And when it comes to tools of performing threat modeling, right? So this is mainly purely requires cognitive intelligence. Someone has to understand the architecture diagrams, someone has to understand the design documents, and then go ahead with threat modeling activity. So there are some tools that support or empower the activity of threat modeling, but it's not something like where we can say it's totally automated, right? We can't say, yes, we fed something to the tool and it gave us a report, right? That's not possible here because it requires that cognitive intelligence. Someone has to understand it and provide that information to the tool, and the tool, based on the information provided, it returns back with some results, right? There are some automated tools I mean to say again, which help with threat modeling, but yeah, it requires human interference. Right? There's some commercial tools as well. There's a well uh, established, widely used tool called Microsoft Threat Modeling Tool, which is a open source tool. You can download it from the internet, start using it. So it's free to use. So it's really helpful. And if you later download the latest versions, you will have those cloud-based applications as well, where you can perform a threat modeling of those. All right. So I have a question. I'll take this: threat modeling versus pen test. Okay. See, threat modeling, right? We're doing in the design phase. Pen test is done in the deployment phase, right? Pen test we do after the application is developed and deployed in the test environment. We identify the vulnerabilities there. All right. In pen test, we identify the vulnerabilities. Those are shortcut vulnerabilities that are come across in the application. Right. But threat modeling is something like, as I said, we don't have anything developed yet. Is the security architecture diagrams ready and the design documents ready? And we are going to see the flow of what the architecture is written, and if there are controls around that architecture or not, right? This is more of a future state visibility, right? We are not telling, yes, there's a clear-cut a threat here, or there's something like going to impact here. No, we are telling there could be a possibility of a threat here if you do not have this control, right? It's more of a preventive mechanism, right? Very early, so that we don't introduce vulnerabilities. So that is the difference. In design phase, we identify potential threats. In pen testing, in deployment phase, we identify vulnerabilities. That's the difference. So I hope I answered your questions. Okay, can't make it. Okay, let's put it as so that that number goes away. Okay, thanks. I hope I answered your question, right? So I'll just show one more slide and quickly get into details of threat modeling, right? So let's assume a vulnerability is identified in the later stages after deployment, right, or the maintenance stages. So the cost of fixing that vulnerability is very high, right? You see, like these are some estimates or some feedbacks from the surveys done on a few applications on a few organizations. So the cost of fixing a vulnerability at a later stages in the SDLC is huge, right? Uh, it's about $15,000 per vulnerability, right? But if the potential threats are identified early, right, that is, so pen testing, threat modeling is done during the design phase, all right? So when we identify those potential threats early, it's very minimal, right, compared to what we see from a vulnerability arising at a later stage. A potential threat identified early, the cost is very minimal. It saves a lot of time and money to the organizations. Right. So okay. So if you have any questions, please put in the Q&A chat so I don't get confused with the chat here. Right. So this was what I wanted to like show before I deep dive into the threat modeling stages. Okay, let's get in depth into the threat modeling stages. Let's get going there. I hope I'm able to articulate the content better. I hope you're able to understand it. All right. So here we are going to identify understand the process, how a threat modeling is done, how the engagement can be done, right? What are the remediation requirements? What are the dread models, right? That will go into detail. So in the meantime, maybe if if someone is curious to know about Microsoft threat modeling tool, you can download it and have it, try out your hands on it. We can discuss in more detail. Right. So as I said, threat modeling is a structured approach used for identifying, quantifying, and addressing threats. Right. So this is something we need to be well aware of. So we identify threats in threat modeling. We do not identify vulnerabilities. Vulnerabilities come only during the deployment phase, where there is a potential exploit coming from a vulnerability. Right. But here in threat modeling, we can't call any deviations or security issues as a vulnerability, but we'll have to call them as a threat because they are the potential threats, right? So I saw someone raising their hand. Okay. So if you have any questions, please, you can put your questions in your Q&A section here. Right, so that's the importance. Maybe a very good interview question will be like, what's the difference between a threat and a vulnerability, right? Or sometimes they ask, what's the difference between a threat, risk, and a vulnerability? So this is something like very the objective or the words may sound very same, very common, but they have a lot of different meanings, right? A threat, a risk, and a vulnerability. They have their own meaning. Okay, so as I said, benefits of threat modeling is threats can be identified early in the development or design phase, even before the development could start. So it's reduction of ongoing application support cost and helps in formulating security tests. Right. Let's give you an example of an application that has not gone through threat modeling and what happened with it. Right. So this was with a banking application, one of the banking application. So they were going through a transformation program. They had a existing application, but it was not that good, maybe not user friendly. So they wanted to move to latest technologies, and come up with another application. They wanted to transform their applications, right? So what they did is maybe they missed to perform the threat modeling activity, but they covered all the other areas, requirements, security analysis. And what happened is during the deployment phase, they tested everything, all the scenarios, and they like release the application to 100 pilot customers. So even though it's pilot customers, so there was actual money that they can put in the bank and take a withdraw from the bank, right? So with 100 customers, what happened is, let's assume I'm customer A and there's another customer B, right? So when I'm adding a beneficiary into my account, right, and at the same time, customer B also was trying to add his beneficiary details into the same account, into his account, sorry. So we both are trying to add each of our beneficiary details. But what happened is the details that I add to my account, right? So let's assume I was trying to add a person named Krishna and his details, bank account details, into my account, but they started reflecting in customers B account, whom he does not know who Krishna is, right? So this was a security issue, right? You see, let's assume in real scenarios, right? If something like that happens, right? I add someone and blindly I assume, okay, I've added the right person, and I just start making transactions to the person whom I do not know, right? So that's a very bad scenario, especially in a banking case, right? So this was a case of a missing the vulnerability was called as a race condition issue because things were being done at the same time. So maybe the application was not able to have that entitlements, structural entitlements in place to differentiate what details are coming from what user. All right. So this is a classic example, I would say. And yeah, we were able to remediate this issue, but we had to go through the design change, right? We had to start coming up with the structural entitlements. So later what they did is initially they came up with a patch fix. Just to fix this vulnerability, they came up with a patch fix, they fixed it. Then the application, since it was a pilot application, it started growing, right? They started adding new functionalities, new features into the application, right? And this issue was seen in every functionality, every activities of the application that could be done. The same issue was repeated, right? So they can't do a patch fix at each and every functionality or each and every page, right? So they have to do it at a framework level, that is at a design level itself. Right. So it took some time. Yeah, definitely, since it was 100 pilot customers, so the impact was minimized, so, because they went in a structured manner. Um, and they had to take some time out to remediate this issue thoroughly at a framework level, and then start building the application on top of it again, right? And yeah, let's assume it's 100 pilot customers and this happened, right? And if all the users of the bank were migrated to the new application and they started seeing this, right? It's a big impact to the bank, right? The customers start losing their trust on the bank. They know they come to a conclusion there's some fraud happening, there's some bad conclusions which can hit the reputation of the bank and can lead to revenue losses, right? So yeah, so if they had the structural entitlements in place, if they had developed the code better right from the beginning to ensure this does not happen, the race condition issue does not happen, there's proper authorization checks at each and every level, or each and every activity that each and every customer does, yeah, they could have avoided this scenario. Right. Any questions on that? I hope everyone are able to understand the scenario. Yeah, going ahead. Okay, so we'll quickly go into the pre-engagements, right? What are the pre-engagement requirements for threat modeling? So we need architecture, application overview presentation, someone to give us an application overview, what uh, application looks like, right? I mean, it's not the walkthrough, but it's an overview for someone to tell us, right? The architects to tell us what the intention of the application, what is it intended to do, what are the technologies behind, what are the compliance requirements behind, if it's holding any customer data, PII data. So we get an overview from the uh, designers or architects. Then we get an architecture diagram from them, and we get some code which SDLC checklist. As I said, like what compliance requirements are there, what are the standards they're followed, right? And yeah, we can also confirm on the threat modeling dates and SLAs, right? It depends. SLAs depend on the size of the project. The post engagement is once threat modeling is completed, we list down all the threats that have been identified. It could be your database, so that it's seen across by all the stakeholders. Everyone can put in their thoughts, comments, and like help us to come up with a structured approach for remediating them. Review all the findings identified, walk through the remediations. So we give a walkthrough to the developers or to the stakeholders to say, okay, there's a possibility of a potential threat here. Do you have any control for this? If there's no control, you need to remediate this, or you need to have this implemented so that this does not result into a vulnerability. And we share the final risk assessment report. Yes, the architecture is good to go and the developers can start developing, or no, the architecture is bad, they need to come up with these controls, fix the architecture diagram, and then you can go start developing it, right? It's also useful to the developers. We walk through all those potential findings when if there's any identified, so that they're also across them, and when they can write their code better, even like having these controls in mind, they can write a secure code while developing their application. All right, so let's quickly get into threat modeling phases. Okay, we'll go into the quick diagram, which is easy. Right, application overview asset identifications. Identify what application does. As I said, we understand what the application does, understand the application architecture, and identify the assets. Identify the technologies. Technologies is your servers, server versions, languages used, right? Load balancers, firewalls, right? Understand those technologies, identify those technologies, and capture the high-level overview, the security profiles and security identify, right? So one thing is the main thing. What is we do is like to identify the assets, right? So assets can be a physical server or a database or data in the database, right? All this become assets, right? We are to identify the assets and come up with a approach how we can protect each of the assets, right? So that's the thing. And before going here, like go ahead. So threat modeling can be done for an application that is already developed, but usually as a SDLC approach, all right, we do threat modeling before the application is developed. Let's assume threat modeling was not there a few years back and the application is there. There's a legacy application, right? So it does not mean we can't do threat modeling for that. We can do threat modeling, right? And we can identify those threats and tell the uh, applications, because the technologies or the vulnerabilities maybe that was there about 5 years back, right? It's not the same case now, right? The attackers have become more sophisticated, they become more knowledgeable, right? And using the same older technologies, there could be a new vulnerability that has come up, and the application is not uh, added or do not have the controls, but there's a possibility of a potential vulnerability there, right? So we can do for already developed application, right? But most commonly, as part of the SDLC process, it's done for application that is still being yet to be developed, right? And also let's assume for release one, right, it's a new application, and for release one, release two, they started a new functionalities, new endpoints were added, right? So we can take that part of the delta architecture, right, the new addition to the architecture, and perform a threat modeling only to that new additions, delta additions. We may not need to do the other part because it's already done. We can do threat modeling for only the delta part that is being added, right? So that's something like you can follow, so that like uh, we don't miss out on the possible threats, right? So that's the common mistake. What people do is they do a threat modeling once and they forget about the continuous process of implementing or going through those SDLCs for later releases, right? So it's all necessary whenever the new endpoint is added or new functionality change is happening, right? It's important that we go through threat modeling. So the later stages, it may take less time because it's a small part of it being added. It may take very less time, but it is important for us to perform a threat modeling there also. Right. So there's the application overview and asset identification stage. The second stage is application decomposition. Right. So in this phase, what we're going to do is, let's assume we have a simple architecture diagram for one of the application that we have from the architects, right? We decompose it. Decompose it in the sense we break the application in terms of, I mean to say, it's not physical breaking, is that logical understanding of application. We start putting the assets into the trust boundaries, right? We start having those connections between the database, between the web servers, app servers, right? We see what are the protocols being used. So we are decomposing it. We're breaking the application logically, putting them into trusted zones, semi-trusted zones, untrusted zones, having those connections in place, having those protocols in place and telling, okay, this is the final data flow diagram that will help us to identify the threats. All right. So let me quickly show you how that looks like. So if someone has already downloaded, okay. So as I said, this is a open source tool. You can download it and start using. So let's assume we'll take a already created model. I think there's a sample threat model. We'll open that. Don't go by the logic of it. It's a very simple application. So it's something like a UML diagram that you may create, right? A UML diagram that, or a visual diagram that you may have created, right? So you have a stencils part here. So there's a big list of stencils. Let's assume you have a web application server, right? So you add just drag and drop cases. You have a web server, right? And you have something like a client, right? And also there's something called a boundary, right? You can see there's a segregation, and these are some of the uh, was this stencils for cloud based, right? This is something updated version of it, right? If it can be more specific, if you want Azure or AWS, you get those stencils also available. And these are the connections. If it's HTTP connection, other protocols, HTTPS protocols, named pipe, SMBs, right? And the trust boundaries. This is what I was telling about, right? Like let's assume you want to have a fully trusted, fully trusted zone, all right? That is something like a data center, right? So you can create your data center here, and let's assume if you have your database in the data center, right? Let's assume you have your skills database in the data center, something like this, right? And you have a internet boundary, right? Or a sandbox boundary is more of a DMZ zone or demilitarized zones, and you have your internet explorers, right? The client boundaries or the untrusted boundaries. So you can pull here, pull this here. Right. I'll just give you an example. Let's assume we have our web server on app server in a DMZ zone. All right. And we have the browser client externally. Okay. I'm just giving a very rough figure considering the time limit we have. All right. And let's assume we have a HTTPS connection between each of them. Okay. See, you can have the connections here. You can make it bi-directional also. All right, you can make those connections. So yeah, this is how you're breaking down your architecture diagram and coming with a data flow diagram. I'm just wanted to demo this so that you understand what's the difference between architecture diagram and the data flow diagram, right? And this is a very not so good architecture. So don't go by this. So I'm just telling how to use the tool. And you have something called, let's assume you have completed your data flow diagrams, right? You have a functionality or a feature where it creates a full report to you. Okay. So here, since we have all others, other diagrams or other systems in place, we may not get a correct report, but I'm just telling how you can use the tool. All right. So you see, get whatever was there, and you get what's added, right? And it tells you what are the possible threats, right? So there could be a false positives, but this is something like you can use this report as a checklist, all right? To ensure like if your application is meeting all those controls or not. You can use it as a simple checklist and tell if there's a potential threat or not, or you can ask your architects, hey, this is one of the finding. Do you show me how you're protecting against this threat? All right. So you can use this. So yeah, as I said, if someone has already installed it and have any questions, you can ask me. I'll try to answer them. But this is how you use a Microsoft threat modeling tool and come up with a report. There are many other tools as well, right? There's something called Threat Modeler, which is a commercial tool, but still it's evolving, right? Because this is manual approach, a lot of manual processes in place, but the tools are evolving. Maybe down the line we can see some good tools where you can totally rely on them, but at this stage we need the cognitive intelligence to understand the differences between to understand the architecture and feed that to the tool, right? So these are the boundaries, what we saw, the corporate boundaries, the DMZ boundaries or external boundaries, the data flows, the way we created those flows from one zone to another zone, and the entry criterias and exit criterias, exit points, right? Sorry, entry and exit points. So where is our data originating? Where does it end, right? So the next is threat determination. Okay, we identify threats using stride methodology. I'll go into detail of this. There you can find many threat modeling approaches, right? One is stride. There are many approaches, but the fundamentals will be the same, but the way they name it, they classify it is different. So if someone is comfortable with stride, they can continue. It's not something like you need to change to another approach. If you are comfortable with one model, you can continue with it. So the objective is to identify vulnerabilities. So any approach, any model you are using, you will be coming across those vulnerabilities. So I'll go into detail after this into stride model and identify threats using secure coding checklist, identify use and abuse cases. So all this is something like you start thinking in the security angle, right? So is there a requirement here for a secure control checklist, right? What are your attack patterns, attack surfaces, right? You can determine there. And the next stage is once you've identified a few threats using the stride model, using your data flow diagrams, uh, there's something called a dread model. I'll go into detail here also. So dread model is used to rate the severity of your threat, right? So if you're calling it as, let's assume, according to me, it is critical threat, right? So how do I convey that it is critical to the audience, to the other audience, or how do I support my case where I say it's a critical? What are my parameters to say, yes, this is a critical vulnerability? I need to have some ground baselines for that, right? So it's a risk rating mechanism. So based on a few criterias, I determine if it's if the potential, the threat is critical, high, medium, or low. Right? And also, this is very similar in line to something called CVSS. CVSS is Common Vulnerability Scoring System. Right? You can find this on the internet. Again, I've opened it. Okay. So this is, you can just search for CVSS calculator. You get a scoring mechanism. So you can get a base score. There's something called base score. And I'll demo this also in detail, but if someone is keen in trying it out, you can start trying it out and ask your questions, if any. So this is an online free tool to calculate this risk rating. Okay. Then comes the reporting, verification, and closure, right? How we track, how we report it, and how we verify all the vulnerability, all the threats are verified and closed, right? So we'll quickly go into two things. One is the stride model and the dread model, right? So the stride model, as you can see, right? So this is a short form for the names, what you can see under types. All right. S stands for spoofing. T stands for data tampering. R stands for repudiation. I stands for information disclosure. D for denial of service. E for elevation of privileges. Right. So whatever potential threats are, right, they fall under a broader categories of stride model. Right. You can't have any other threat other than what's there in the stride. Right. So spoofing is, let's assume, users, right? So if I'm able to brute force into application or impersonate another user, right, or try to access other users' pages, or try to get their credentials, right? All of that falls under spoofing. Spoofing is something like impersonating a user, right? Attacker taking credentials or trying multiple approaches to brute force into the application, steal the credentials. All that falls under spoofing. Tampering of data. Tampering of data is something like modifying the data that's existing in the database, that's there in the database, try to manipulate the data, tamper with it, change the details in the database, right? So that is data tampering. It is the control for this is called as integrity, because any data that is tampered with it results in an integrity issue, right? No unauthorized user should be able to tamper any data, though sensitive or not. They should not be able to tamper the data. Repudiation, all right? Repudiation is something like to track the actions of a user, all right? Let's assume I'm a user, I made a transaction of $10, right? And that should be recorded, that should be logged. Okay, this user at so and so time performed a transaction from this account to another account, right? From this IP and all that, all those details, right? Because I should not be able to deny, okay, I've not done any transaction, why I'm seeing a reduction in my account. Right? I'm just giving a case, maybe a bad example, but let's assume like you made some transactions uh, and they're not getting logged, and someone tells no, they're not made the transaction, right? So those cases, you need to have a proper logging mechanism, and no one should be able to deny that they've not done any action or not transactions, right? Sometimes it could be an attacker doing it on behalf of a user, right? But it's that should be recorded, right? From what IP is doing, from where was the source of this particular request coming from, right? So that will help differentiate a legitimate request and a malicious request. Sorry, give me a sec. I'll have some water. Yeah, sorry. That was about repudiation. Every transaction, every event. So the details of what was the transaction, right? If someone changed the password, right? What time it was changed. So all that should be recorded in the logs, right? You should be able to trace the activities. The next one is information disclosure. It's something like someone getting unauthorized access, seeing more data than what they're authorized to see, or vulnerability that can result in information disclosure. So all that falls under information disclosure. So the category for this is the security control is called confidentiality. Right. Next is denial of service. Denial of service is to ensure the applications or the systems are available to end users all the time, right? Let's assume your banking application, and if you're not able to use your internet banking, or make a transaction when you want to do it, right, it doesn't solve the purpose, right? So there can be attacks where someone can try to bombard the servers with multiple data, with some requests and try to impact the availability of a system, right? So all that falls under denial of service. I'll quickly finish this elevation of privilege and take up Sunil's question. Elevation of privilege is yeah gaining access that I'm not supposed to have, right? Let's assume I'm a employee, right? If I'm able to manipulate some parameters and elevate my privilege to that of a manager or to that of a finance person or a HR person, right? So that is, I'm elevating my privileges from a lower level to a higher level, right? Maybe you could have seen some cases wherein uh, an attacker or malicious user misuse the flaws within the application, try to raise a request and also get it approved, right? And elevation of privileges can be of two types: vertical level, that is like a normal user to a mm, more privileged user, or like admin, super admin, right? Or it can be at the same horizontal level, right? Like one employee trying to see another employee's data, or one user trying to see another user's data who are the same role access levels, right? So that is horizontal levels. So the other one, what we discussed earlier, was vertical level. Yeah, Sunil, can you put your question here? Sunil, can you drop your question? You raised your hand. If you can speak, you can let me know, or else you can drop your question in the Q&A. Yeah, sorry, I can't see your question if in chat. Okay, so these are the stride approaches. This is the stride approach where we define the methodologies what we are going to follow to identify the potential threats. So in this model here, you can also say, okay, secure coding guidelines should be followed just for information purposes, because that can lead to a potential threat if secure coding guidelines are not followed. Components, open source components that the users use, right? The developers use, they should be the latest secure versions. They should not use the vulnerable versions. You can make them as a checklist here when you are reporting it. So it's not a threat. It's not, I mean, it's not a vulnerability at this stage, but it's a threat if they're not following it, right? So you can list those activities also, right? And something like if you want to perform penetration testing, like every once in a year, external pen testing once in a year, internal pen testing regularly whenever there's a release, right? You can list them out and tell them, okay, you perform these activities so that like we don't see threats at a later stage. This was about stride model. I'll quickly go into dread model. Okay, so DRED again stands for the first letters, first five categories of the parameters that are used to uh, come up with a residual score of a vulnerability threat. So DREAD. So the first D stands for damage potential. R stands for reproducibility, E is for exploitability, affected users, discoverability, right? So damage potential is what is the potential damage, right? To what level can this, if there's a threat identified, what can be the impact of it, right? Let's assume there's denial of service issue. There's no control, there's no rate limiting feature, or there's no uh, uh, was a protection for throttling scenarios, right? No load balancers are there. So that can result in denial of service. So if the application is not available to end users, what's the potential threat, right? So we come up to the scale of understanding the impact to the application using the DRED approach. Reproducibility is something like how easy it is to reproduce a vulnerability, right? If it's very easy, sorry, it's a threat here. So it's easy to identify a threat. It's easy to exploit that threat, right? So that is reproducibility. Exploitability, again, how much time does it take? Does it need any sophisticated softwares, right? Uh, does the user need to be, or does the attacker need to be a user? Does he need any privileges? Does he need user interactions for the uh, exploit to happen, right? That is exploitability. Affected users, what are the number of users, right, who get affected? Let's assume, again, take the case of denial of service. So it will be if the systems are not available, it affects each and every user. But there are some threats or vulnerabilities that can impact one user or a group of users. All right. So depending on the exploits, we can understand how many users are affected or can be affected. And discoverability. Discoverability is how easy was it to find the threat vulnerabilities, right? So these are the 5 questions based on which we start answering them. We provide a score A, B, C, D, E for each of them, right? So I'll just, yeah, and we come up with the risk levels, right? So this is a manual approach, right? The DREAD model. So we see critical issues, high, medium, and low. So let's see the same, if how we can use a CVSS calculator to come up with a residual risk. All right. Okay, let's assume we have one vulnerability, right? It's something like external user, right? External attacker from outside the network. He need not be your internal employee. He can be your, I'm just giving a scenario. He can be an external user who can attack the application from external network. It's a public facing application. So he can perform some malicious activities externally, right? So we have something called attack vector for this. So is the attack happening externally, right? So there's something called network, right? So these are the answers. So maybe you can consider these as your questions, right? These 8 questions, and these are the answers for you. And when you hover your mouse over the answers, right, to understand what the calculator is asking, like what it understands, so you get the description of each of those answers, right? Let's assume it's a network, right? I said it's a public facing network, right? So you get the description here. If you're not able to understand any of these options given, you can use this, just over your mouse on it, and you'll get the answer, right? So each of these cases, each of the options, you get the description of what it actually means, right? So attack network, it's a public network. External network, adjacent networks, more of an internal network. Local area network within the same zones. Physical network or something like a medical device or something there on the same device, right? It's a physical network, physical component, right? So since here we're talking about external network, we'll go answer it as network. So you see the color changing to green when I click the answer, right? And also here, right, on your right hand side, you don't have a score, right? When you fill all these answers, you get a score, right? So I'm just telling so that you keep a watch on this. Attack complexity, right? We saw here how the DREAD model, how easy it was to identify. So we have answers like it's very easy to identify. It's hard to identify, right? Low is easy to identify. High is, it was a bit hard to identify, right? Let's assume it was a bit hard to identify. Let's take an example of SQL injection where someone was able to take some customers' data. So that's the scenario. He was able to do it from an external network. The ease of exploitation was a bit high. It was a bit hard for him to attack, right? Privileges required. So to perform this attack, right, did he require to elevate his privileges, or did he wanted to, like, did he have to be a user, right? For some cases, right, you need to be a user in your application to access some of the functionalities, right? So those are some of the considerations here. Let's assume he did not require any privileges. User interactions. Next question is user interactions. Like, let's assume in a phishing attack, right? For a phishing attack to happen, the victim user has to click on those phishing links or else the attack does not get completed. All right, it will not be a successful attack. Only if the user clicks on those links, then only it will be a successful attack. So let's, in this case, let's assume since there's no phishing involved, so there's no user interactions required, or the other examples of user interaction is something like user had to be logged into the system for the attack to happen. Right. So those are some of the examples. So in this case, there was no user interaction required. Scope, right? We see what the scope is. Like the affected resources, did they manage to, were they managed by the same security authority, or was it a third-party authority, right? That becomes the scope. Was they able to change some functionalities or not? That becomes the scope. So let's say in this case, the scope was not changed. It was within the same certifying authority. And the last three questions are the impact, right? So as we saw here in the previous exam document, so the impact will fall under confidentiality, integrity, and availability. So the confidentiality is something like someone is able to get view unauthorized data. Integrity is something like someone is able to tamper the data that they're not supposed to do. Availability is the someone as an attacker trying to bring down the availability of the machines, trying to make them, creating a case of denial of service and making it non-available to the end users. So these three last questions become the impacts, right? Let's take the example, like in this case, confidentiality. We talked about SQL injection. Vulnerability, yes, the attacker was able to get some customer data, so the confidentiality was breached. So the impact is high, right? Low is something like none, no impact to confidentiality. Low is there was a slight impact, some loss, but may not be very sensitive, or does not result in a compliance issue, something like that. Right? And next is integrity. Since in our example we took, the attacker was able to get some data, he was not able to modify anything. So integrity is none. Availability is also none, because he was just able to get the data. He did not impact the availability through the end users. So just observe here. If I give the answer, you'll get a score here, right? You see this, you get a score of 5.9, which is medium severity. So we just took a very hypothetical scenario. Let's assume like you have you toggle your answers, right? Something like the scope was changed. You see the score going up. This vulnerability had an impact to integrity also, right? It had an impact on availability also. You see the scores going up, right? So the scores can be up to 10. Okay, right? It can go up to 10. So anything between 9.1 to 10 is critical. Anything between 7.1 to 9 is high. Anything between 4.1 to 6.9 or 7 is medium. Anything below that will be low. Right? This is how the CVS calculator works. Right. So based on this, we can say, okay, the potential threat of this issue was critical, high, medium, low, and you'll be able to substantiate your scoring level, because this is where a lot of friction happens. People do not agree with your scoring mechanism, right? So you can provide support your case with this calculator. So you can also record this. There's something called what's this vector string here, CVSS 3.1, right? You see this. So if you're rating any vulnerability, you can copy this vector string along, and maybe when you're giving the score, you can also copy the vector string. All right. So what happens with this vector string is, you can, maybe let's assume you're revisiting this case after 6 months and you do not totally remember the context, right? So it's hard to come back or tell what the issue was, how you came up with this score. All right. So this CSS vector will help you track back your answers. See, what I'll do is, so just remove this. So you get a blank page, right? So even our mind will be blank like this after 6 months, because we work on many other issues, many other vulnerabilities. We don't totally do not remember the context. So what we can do is, if you are made a note of your vector string against your score, right, you just need to put a pound symbol in the URL and copy that vector string and hit the URL. So you get back all your answers, right? And now you can remember, like, oh, this was an external attack from an external network. The complexity was low, right? It had an impact to confidentiality, low and low impact to integrity, and low impact to availability. And so this was the score, right? You can support your answers like this. So I'll just take 2 more questions here. Can we see threats only using code and any other threats? Can also please record, share this doc. Yes, I'll share this document. Can you share the threat modeling document? Yes, I'll share this PowerPoint slides on threat modeling document. Can we see threats only using code? See, when we are using source code, right, it's not a threat, it will be a vulnerability, as I said, right? Threat is something like, you can see the threat by using the source code. But yeah, this something like you're telling it's a potential threat, right? You're not telling this is a exploit. Yes, you can see it from your code also. And yeah, since code level also, right, you're not yet exploited or you're not tested it, and you don't have a POC yet. So at those levels, you can call it as a threat or a vulnerability at a code level. Yes, you can identify threats at a code level also. Right, and yeah, you have more. Uh, if you want to go in depth, right, for something like a network issue, all right, you have more questions, answers. But for me, I've never had to use all this. I was able to survive with only the base score so far. So most of the scenarios, what I've seen is we just need a base score. So if you know about the vulnerability more in detail, you can go with the temporal score. I've not used these other mechanisms, environmental issues, or environmental scores, all that. But maybe if you want to try, you can try. So since you have those answers, right, it looks very similar to what we discussed, right? You can start seeing, changing your answers and get a score, right? So I'm just telling this because I never had a chance to use this, or I did not had to use this. So the base score was sufficient for me to provide the justifications for the vulnerabilities or threats identified. I think we are right on time. Okay. Okay, this was my this was what I had to convey. I hope I've articulated in a better way, uh, so that you have understood it. Yeah. If there's any questions, you can drop in the chat, or else I think we are good with this session. Thanks all for joining.